One of the events happened very, very early in my career. I was only a neurology resident for 3 weeks, and that was the death of my mother. My mother was mismanaged, and that was responsible for her dying. And here I am, a young physician, so excited about doing neurology, and that's what I'd always wanted to do. But my mother, in dying, taught me something as a physician and helped me move forward, I think.
Some experts chase attention, but the smart ones build authority. You're listening to the Authority on Demand podcast, where credibility becomes your competitive advantage. Every week, we're pulling back the curtain on how founders and leaders turn expertise into inbound demand through books that position, media that converse, and strategies that actually move the needle. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authority on Demand. Now, let's turn your authority into leverage.
They were reading poems and other things. And I said, well, I don't have anything. I'm just going to listen. And they said, you've got to have something. Must have something you can entertain us with. So I opened up my computer and got out some of these journal entries. They weren't literary, but they were just stories. And they loved them. And every night they just wanted to hear more medical stories. You've got to have more, read us more. And that's when I realized that these stories were really inspiring.
Some experts chase attention, but the smart ones build authority. You're listening to the Authority on Demand podcast, where credibility becomes your competitive advantage. Every week, we're pulling back the curtain on how founders and leaders turn expertise into inbound demand through books that position, media that converse, and strategies that actually move the needle. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authority on Demand. Now, let's turn your authority into leverage.
So, what happens when a pioneering woman doctor who broke barriers at Notre Dame in neurology discovers that her greatest teacher wasn't in a textbook, but in the fears and hopes of her patients? Today, we're joined by Dr. Carolyn Taylor, whose memoir, Whispers of the Mind, reveals decades of extraordinary medical encounters from the ICU to her office, where a golden retriever named Prancer helped heal hearts alongside minds. So, it's going to be a really fun experience, a great chat here today. So, buckle in and let's get right to it. Carolyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, real quick before we jump back in, if you're loving what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button and drop us a like. We're bringing you the best authors, the most real conversations, and all the writing wisdom that you didn't know you needed. So stick around because it only gets better from here. All right, now let's get back to the conversation.
Of course. Yeah. As I was saying right before this recording started, I think this is a story that a lot of people can benefit from, not only for, knowing what you've gone through and the experience it's had, but the writing process too, and such a unique type of book. So we're in for a good conversation today.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, so let's dive right into it. I mean, before we chat about the book itself, I always do like to get to know my authors a little bit here. So, what exactly was the moment when you decided, you know what, I have to start writing this down on paper? I'm sure there's like some type of a spark or a catalyst that made you decide to start recording everything. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, in medical training, you come up against some pretty devastating things, when people die or or something goes bad.
Mhm.
And, people are sick. Especially when you're in training, you're doing a lot of in-hospital work. And that was my way of processing my feelings. I
Mm.
would come home after a particularly bad day. And in order to get to sleep at night, I found that journaling helped me take it out of my mind, put it on paper, and then it was there, and I could lay down and go to sleep and get through the next day. And so over time, I found that I was doing that more and more, and I collected these stories. They weren't in literary form, just journaling on
Mm.
my um, and I didn't journal every day, but when something bad would happen or something that was difficult and I needed to process it, I would write it down. So I got through my life, my journey in medicine. And after about 3 decades, I was ready to at least semi-retire. And I decided that I'd always wanted to write. So I had written this manuscript that was really memoir-like. And I went to a workshop that was like 7-day workshop with other writers. And in the evenings, we would have just a relaxed time where people would read little things that they'd written, not the project that they had gone there for. And, they were reading poems and other things. And I said, well, I don't have anything. I'm just going to listen. And they said, you've got to have something. Must have something you can entertain us with. So I opened up my computer and got out some of these journal entries, ones that I thought would be entertaining. And they weren't literary, but they were just stories. And they loved them. And every night they just wanted to hear more medical stories. You've got to have more, read us more. So I was the main entertainer, it seemed. And that's when I realized that these stories were really inspiring. So I decided to put them in literary form. And my reason was twofold. Some of these stories were so very inspiring about my patients that were dealing with devastating disease. And they're the real heroes of the book. And I thought that, it's everyday people and that my readers could somehow connect with them, the general humanity of us all, that we're all really the same, and also find some inspiration from my patients. I also wanted to humanize medicine because doctors are human and they can make mistakes and they have feelings when they're dealing with difficult situations. And uh, in these difficult times when there's so much distrust in medicine, I thought that that would be also helpful. So it's a story about the human spirit and the resilience of all of us.
Yeah, so that's really cool how it came to be. Started just kind of journaling here and there, and you realize the stories were inspiring. And when you get that sort of feedback, of course, you have to do something with it. You have to make sure more people see it because you never know what the ripple effect of having it out there might be. So I'm really glad that you kind of took that on, and here we are now, and we have this book to learn from and to get to know you a bit more. Do you happen to have a copy of the book with you by any chance?
Yes, I do. And here it is.
Okay, there it is. And I'm really glad that you brought it because I think it just has a beautiful cover. If you hold it up a little bit more, you can see everybody that it's a picture of a beautiful flower on a person's mind, which is just very, metaphorical and symbolic of the title itself and the content. Can you share a little bit about that choice for the cover?
Well, we had our publisher had excellent graphic designers, and I didn't. I told them about the book and that it was more of a kind of spiritual book about humanity and about, the human spirit. And so that I didn't want a picture of a brain or neurons or anything of that nature that looked more academic. And they came up with a variety of samples. And I just love this one. I said, this is just perfect. It's just what I was looking for.
Yes, yeah, and it's very eye-catching and it tells the story in itself in that one image. And I think that's something a lot of authors can learn from. It's something that um it's just a great way to really set a good precedent for your book.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you for sharing that. But a little bit about you and the writing process also. I'm sure that writing this book must have just been kind of challenging to do. I mean, I know that you wrote the essays over time, but kind of going through it all and combining it together must have been a little bit of a struggle because there's so much personal information that's engraved in there. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that. What was your process like for deciding which essays to put in there, which journal prompts to leave out? Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I have a lot of them in this journal, and I wanted to pick out ones that I thought were interesting and different and instructive. So I picked out some diseases that people have probably never heard of, and I wanted to use illustrative stories to highlight some universal themes. So there's numerous stories in there about addiction, stories about grief, stories about death with dignity. And then in the book, it begins with me in medical school and going all the way up to private practice. You can also see the transformation of a young physician that becomes the seasoned neurologist. And there was quite a few very personal stories in there that have to do with neurology, that also have to do with my universal themes, where I dealt with the death of a mother, a father, a brother, And they all died of something neurologic. And I was a critical person in that whole scene of helping to decide how they would die. And
Wow.
it brings up it illustrates death with dignity, I think, very well. One of the events happened very, very early in my career. I was only in a neurology resident for 3 weeks. And that was the death of my mother. And that was particularly difficult because my mother was mismanaged, and that was responsible for her dying. And here I am, a young physician, so excited about doing neurology, and it's what I'd always wanted to do. And I'm there, and then all of a sudden, my mother um, is in a hospital in New Jersey and dies of at the Jersey Shore. I say that because I was in Philadelphia, so I was going back and forth from Philadelphia to New Jersey, where I grew up. And she dies from a massive bleed because she was put on a blood thinner and nobody watched the levels. And so basically, she had a massive stroke. And
Wow. That's I'm really sorry that that happened. Like it's amazing to think that that's just a simple mistake like that. Not simple, but negligence. Like I'm so sorry.
it was.
Yeah.
And so it was a week-long, drawn-out process of deciding what to do. And as the only physician in the family, I was the one that made many of the decisions. So she died on a Thursday. We buried her on a Saturday, and on Sunday, I was on call at the hospital again, all day and overnight. And I got through that week, and then I just totally deteriorated when I got into the hospital, and I had to then deal with other people, older people, people in intensive care units on ventilators like my mother was, and all I could see was my mother. And I almost didn't make it. I didn't make it through the day, and I almost didn't stay in medicine because I was so devastated about the negligence. And it illustrated how human physicians are, although this was true negligence. And I just wanted to do anything at that point but neurology. I didn't want to deal with people that were really sick. I thought, well, maybe I could go and do ophthalmology or do something else that would still be medicine. But over that year, I think it made me a more compassionate physician early on, because I could really see my patients' pain. And when I dealt with families that were going through this, I had been through it myself. So I think I was more compassionate. I was more empathetic with what they were living through, to my detriment, actually. But I got through it. And it took me almost that entire year, but I was glad then that I was stayed in neurology. And you just move on somehow. But my mother, in dying, taught me something as a physician and helped me move forward, I think.
Absolutely. And I'm glad they could put a positive light on that at least. I mean, it's such a hard thing to happen to anybody, but even more so when you're in the field, you know what should have been done, and you had to figure out, okay, what do I do from here? It's a lot on you along with your family, but I think what's important to know, as you said, is that you learned a lot from it, and now it's in your book so others can also. And just like kudos to the for being able to really express that to everybody. It's really important. And that's just one of your essays about death with dignity. So to kind of branch off of that, I mean, it's a very complex ethical issue, but what do you think that readers should learn to understand about end of life care in that regard?
Well, I think too often it's something people haven't thought about. And all of a sudden they find themselves in an intensive care unit with a loved one. And if there isn't a living will, for instance, if someone young comes in and they're dying, it's a real struggle because they have to decide what to do in that case, and they have to try to sort out what their loved one would want them to do. And there's so many issues like organ donation and things like that, especially if it's a case of a trauma or sometimes an overdose. So there are decisions that it takes some time. They can't just process it in an hour. Sometimes you need to keep someone on a respirator for a day or so so that they can process what's just happened and try
Right.
to move on and at least save other lives from this situation. But the idea of keeping someone alive at any cost, especially in neurologic cases when you know that there's no meaningful, I use that term a lot in the book, no meaningful recovery. And that
Mm.
we try to counsel patients that in this particular case, yes, they might be alive. They might not even be technically brain dead. Their brainstem may be alive. They may be able to come off a respirator, but they may be in a vegetative state or completely paralyzed or unable to speak or communicate. And, you have to decide what's meaningful. It,
Right.
it's
Really hard to
interesting.
but
It is. I had a physician as a patient once, an older gentleman that I had known um, that came in with a stroke to our service. And he had a clear living will that he didn't want any extraordinary measures. But when he was in that situation and he was going to be hemiplegic and probably spend the rest of his days in a nursing home, which is something he didn't want, he actually changed his mind. He did want everything done at that when he was in that situation. So it's not always black and white,
yeah,
and they're difficult things to deal with.
absolutely. And clearly it was very hard for you to go through all of those. And as I mentioned before, reliving it all while putting it into the book. So again, amazing that you have it out here now. But I guess another part of this and a part of the writing process that a lot of authors can learn from is you have to balance medical accuracy with all this, all these emotional stories. So, what was that research process like, and was it challenging to create that balance?
It was. I think that was one of the most challenging things about writing this book. And so I tried to pretend I was just delivering the news about a disease to a patient or their family who had never heard of the disease before. So I tried to explain it to them in a way that they would understand. And you get better at that over the years when you see the blank look on their face, you know that they don't know what you're talking about. And you try to make it a little bit easier. And I had the advantage of a wonderful editor who was not a medical professional. So if he came to me and said, I didn't understand this piece or this paragraph, I think you better rewrite it. And then I would just rewrite it again to put it in more layman's terms. And that was hugely helpful for me. A lot of rewriting.
A lot of rewriting, yeah, but also it sounds like a pretty strong partnership in that regard. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Was it very collaborative, would you say, or kind of like a back and forth?
It was an editor that had worked with physicians before on books, so he was used to that process and dealing with medical issues. And it wasn't your typical editor where you'd send things back and forth in email. We talked on the phone almost every day. He'd read an essay and then he would go through it. Or sometimes he'd just call me after the first time he read it and say, you've got to, I had a hard time understanding it. Maybe you want to rewrite certain sections.
Mm.
Um, or he'd ask me, specific questions. And or he'd say, maybe you could write this so that there's something a little uplifting at the end of it too, so it's not so the reader comes away from this not feeling totally disillusioned.
Hopeless,
Yeah.
disillusioned, yeah.
And oh yes. And so I would, okay, and I would go back. And so some of these essays I rewrote several times. And there was one that I just refused to rewrite. It
Well,
was
which one was that?
that was the one called Sorry. It was about the death of my father. And he felt that I should say up front what it was about and who it was about. But I wanted it to be a surprise at the end. You read this story and it sounds like I'm talking about just a patient that I got to know. And at the very end of the story, you realize it's my own father.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and so I was going to stick to that one that I thought that made it a little bit more powerful.
So why choose to present it in that way, would you say? Other than
Huh.
just stating it more outright, why the mystery element? I mean, of course, audience engagement, but was there anything that made you think, maybe I should hide the big reveal? What do you think?
Well, I thought it was about so much more. It was a story about Parkinson's disease. It was also a story about death with dignity. And it was a story of a little girl whose father walked out when she was 4 and never saw or heard from him again for 26 years. So it was a story about forgiveness. And it's called Sorry because I looked him up when I was grown up. And all I ever wanted, was to just have him say he was sorry. And that was what it was all about. So I meet him later in life, and he has this discussion with me, knowing I'm a neurologist, that how he'd want to die if he was ever in that situation. And then he gets Parkinson's disease. And of course, I'm a neurologist. So we talk a lot about Parkinson's, and I helped him get a specialist in the area where he lived. He lived in the Midwest. And we visited for a while, talked on the phone, but I never was able to reestablish the father-daughter relationship. So I talk about him like he became a good friend, and that's kind of what he did over the years. I knew him for 10 years before he died. And in the end, when I realized he hadn't told me that he had deteriorated so much and was in a hospital and then nursing home in the exact situation he never wanted to be in, um, on a feeding tube and on hospice, not on hospice yet, I decided to fly out there. And he asked me if I remembered that phone conversation that we'd had about how he wanted to die. And when I said I did, he said, please help me. So I did. And so in that moment, it was a story of real forgiveness, although he never said, I'm sorry. Um, our last exchange after I made the arrangements for him and I had to leave in the middle of the night, I went in to see him, and he reached up and threw his arms around me and told me he loved me. And that was his saying he was sorry. And of course, I forgave him. I forgave him probably long before that. But there was never an exchange. There was never a discussion about what had happened. It was just like we picked up where we left off, but we couldn't really pick up. And it was a story of forgiveness. But I was in the doctor role of arranging for him to stop using the feeding tube and stop hydration and get morphine for comfort, because that's what he wanted. And no one else really could have done that but me. And so it was very sad. He lived a very sad life, but it was a really a story of, everything is rolled into one in that story. It's forgiveness, it's death with dignity. And then you learn a lot about Parkinson's along the way.
Of course. Well, oh my goodness, thank you for sharing that whole like tale with us. If this is any like sample of what we can be in store for the book itself. I mean, I read through it a bit and it's very powerful. And guys, if you're interested today, then I guess you just have to pick up the book and dive in and learn a little bit more. But all this being said, I'm wondering what next is in store for you. I mean, you did mention that you do have another manuscript about motherhood in the works, I believe. But is there anything else as well? Maybe shine a light on that, the motherhood book. What else is in store for us?
Well, I wrote a manuscript, about it's memoirish. It's about motherhood. It's about um, the guilt that you feel when you have a demanding career and you suddenly become a mother. I became a mother in medical school.
Of course.
Um, and how you just don't feel like you're doing anything as well as you really want to. And so there's guilt that goes back and forth both ways. And it's also a powerful story about a family struggling with addiction, a member of the family that becomes addicted, and how that it's an entire family affair, and how it devastates a family, and the struggles that you go through, and a lot of comments about society and how society views addiction and how addiction is stigmatized. And I try to get the point across, even in my book, because I tell several different stories of different kinds of addiction and different types of people, the accidental addiction, and other things, that addiction is not shameful and it's too often stigmatized. And I think that prevents people often from getting the help that they need. And I lay out the path for understanding how addiction is really a brain disease. And until we just treat it like the disease it is, like any other chronic disease, like diabetes or hypertension, um, it's going to fall by the wayside. And it's not a personality flaw. It's not that someone could just say, well, I'm just going to pull myself up by the bootstraps and do what I should have done all along. Their brain is taking them down another way. The cravings are so great that it's imperative to them to get the drug of choice that's more important than food or water or procreation or just about anything else. And so we have a long way to go, I think, with treating people with addiction compassionately.
Understood. And I think that's so important to think about. You're right. I mean, it is stigmatized. I get it. So we just have to raise awareness about it, I guess is what you're trying to say. Would that be like the mission you think that a lot of people should be taking away from this, to be aware and be compassionate and empathetic, and that's how we can best help people? Would you agree that's kind of like the overarching message to take from it?
Yes. And the developing brain, and I have at least a couple of stories in the book about that. There's one called The Complicity of Parents, where I talk about the danger of concussion, particularly in the young athlete whose brain is developing. Because until that brain is developed, and this goes for addiction or trauma, it's like wet cement. And those neural pathways are still developing and coursing through the cement before they're permanent. And if you're exposed, for instance, to too much alcohol or drugs, opiates, prescription medication, or anything that's recreational, at that critical age, once that cement solidifies and your brain is matured, so in the male that could be 25 or 26, and the female it might not be till 23, that brain is altered forever. And so addiction has a far more consequences in the young developing brain than it does in the adult that gets exposed to the drugs later. So it's an important message, I think, for people to come away with, for parents especially to come away with their children.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I really appreciate you like putting that out in there into the world for people to, get on board with. It's an important mission. And that being said, then, if people do want to get on board and learn more and be part of the cause, is there a certain website or social media that they can get connected to you best with and stay up to date with, future projects and the course of the current books?
Yes, I started a website for this book, and it's Carolyn Larkin Taylor author.com, and everything is on there. And you can also have that, there's a link to purchase the book if you want to purchase the book. It's at all your major bookstores, Barnes and Noble, and it's available on Amazon, Apple Books, Google. It will be available in Kindle.
Okay, well, there you are, everybody. We'll have the link in the description box of this podcast today, so you can click over and be, in the know and just stay in touch with Carolyn, because she has an important mission. And, alongside Prancer, your therapy dog, you're here helping everybody, shine light into what needs to be talked about and what needs to be recognized. So thank you for that. And I'm wondering, as we begin to move to the conclusion of our podcast today, if you happen to have any writing tips to the audience today that really helped you along the way, that you think might benefit others if they're trying to take on a similar endeavor, what would you say?
Well, I had some physician writers that I particularly liked. And what I tried to do in kind of emulating them was try to give as much vivid imagery as I could in my stories so that my reader could just kind of immerse themselves in the scene. I wanted them to feel like I was taking them with me in my pocket into the intensive care unit, at the bedside with my patients, um, everywhere that I went, so that they could actually see what I saw and feel what I felt. So I rely a lot on metaphors and, basically that's pretty much it. I read a lot of books. I don't about writing creative nonfiction. I didn't do a master's in it. I wasn't a journalist before. I consider myself a physician who likes to write. And so there was a lot of putting down, I think getting the story down and thinking about what you're going to write is actually the hardest part. And then just revising it, you can revise it again and again and again. And I think if I hadn't been if I didn't have this urgency to get the book out, because I kept thinking, well, I don't have a lot of time here. I want to get the book out before I get too old. And I could still be rewriting it because you never feel like you're done. You always read it again and think, oh, I should change that or I should change this. And finally, I just had to put it away and say, okay, I am done. My editor couldn't find anything else that he thought was um, wrong in the book. And so I'm just ready to put it out there.
Understood. Okay, well, I really appreciate that. And I guess at the end of the day, you're right. You just have to start writing. You have to plan it out, but make that first step too. So, super important for everyone to hold on to today as we move forward and continue on with our own writing journeys. So, Caroline, this has been such an inspiring conversation. I really, appreciate you coming on and sharing your story with us. There's a lot to take in, and it's very emotional and very powerful. But those are the kind of stories we need to hear in this day and age. So, thank you again, and I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
Yes, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and to our listeners today, whether you're also in healthcare, whether you're facing your own medical challenges, or just interested in stories of human resilience, this book is a perfect one for you that you could check out today. The links are in the description box of this podcast. And just as you continue on, remember to just get started like Carolyn taught us and keep writing, keep inspiring, and keep leading. We'll see you next time on the Authors on Mission podcast.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Authority on Demand podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with a founder or a leader who's ready to stop being the best kept secret in their industry. If you want to turn your expertise into inbound demand, head to authorityondemand.com to see how we help clients go from unknown to in demand. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, and I'll catch you on the next one. Now, go build some authority.